starting at 1:10, which is now. So for everyone, welcome to the Birds of a Feather session on research for software engineering papers. I mean, reviews for software engineering research papers. And this session is going to be recorded. I am May Nagapan from a newly minted associate professor at the University of Waterloo. And I'm looking forward to this session. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can find out or what we can discuss about good reviews. What is a good review? I have a few questions prepared so that I can start the discussion. I also got a few questions from a few people who cannot make it, who wanted to ask these questions. But before I start that, I want to give the stage to Nino for a minute to advertise a particular effort. There is a survey out on reviews for papers. Nino, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, May. So this is going to be just a quick blurb. It's sort of a meta blurb in the sense that what I'm going to talk about right now has to do with a problem that is faced by pretty much every area of computer science. It's reported widely. It applies more directly to journals than to conferences, but the issue is likely to trickle down across the board because we are a finite resource. The issue is how does one find qualified reviewers for a paper? And how do you get people to actually agree to review for a paper? I've seen some statistics that I don't want to bore you with, but the number within the last 5 years, the number across the IEEE journals, because I'm involved with an IEEE journal right now most directly, of requested reviews to get a single agreed reviewer has grown by over 1.5 review requests, essentially. So that's it. The problem is getting worse. There are more papers being submitted, not necessarily an obvious way to get an appropriate growth in the number of reviewers. So because of this, the ACM Publications Board has asked me to constitute a task force that will study this problem. And one of the early recommendations of the task force was to try to take the pulse of the community. In other words, not to guess what might incentivize people to agree to review papers more readily, but to actually hear them out, to see what the concerns are. Of course, all of us are overworked. We all have many things on our plates and so on, but this problem is not going to go away. So the purpose of the survey that many of you have received is to try to understand exactly how, or whether it's even possible, to incentivize individuals to say yes when that review request comes. And of course, how we could reasonably expand the pool of reviewers, because some of the suggestions that have been floating around have also been to, even for our best venues that are most selective, to basically allow, for example, really senior, very knowledgeable PhD students, in which case there's the other issue which the task force is really gonna, this Birds of a Feather is really going to discuss, which is how do you actually make sure that those people in fact deliver quality reviews? So just because somebody's knowledgeable in an area doesn't necessarily mean that they'll know how to review a paper in an appropriate way. But anyway, so that's the brief pitch on this task force. And if you've received the survey, please take a few minutes to fill it out. It'll be helpful to the entire community in the long run, and that does include you.
Thank you, Nino. And with that, I'll start. And because there's a lot of people here, if it's okay, I will pose a question and I will ask a few people who I reached out to for comments first, and then it's an open Birds of a Feather session, so the others can jump into if that's okay to run the session this way. So the first question that I want to ask is, what is a good review for a paper in your opinion? And a good review can be accept the paper, right? That's not the review that I'm saying, but more rejecting a paper, but giving good comments. What is a good review for a paper? And if you can also give the context of what type of paper or what kind of paper you're talking about, then that helps with the others kind of understand where your opinions are coming from as well. So in my panel, I'm going to go in how the panel looks for me in the order that it comes up. So I'll start with actually Matt.
Okay. So hi, I'm Matt Dwyer, and I guess I'll just dive into the answer. So it does depend on the context, but I really think there's like two functions here that have to be kept primarily in mind. First, there's the facilitation of making an accept-reject decision in terms of the paper. And what this suggests is that a good review ought to not sit on the fence, but it ought to clearly and concisely justify its position and do all the things it needs to do for the venue in question, assess quality, novelty, value of the paper. So that's like that's one job, but the other job that's equally important is to provide constructive and actionable feedback to the authors. And this can happen in at least two modes in my view. One is if you want to accept a paper, what you want to try to do is tell the authors how to fix or improve whatever issues you might have detected in the paper. But I think it's just as important when you're going to reject a paper to provide constructive and actionable feedback so that the field can progress. And so I think you want to keep those two things in mind: facilitate accept, reject decisions, and provide constructive and actionable feedback to authors.
Thank you so much, Matt. And the next person that I reached out to before was in the list of people that I reached out to is the most recently minted PhD student, although she graduated a couple of years ago now. And Danae, do you want to give your thoughts on, as a student, most recently been a student, and a young researcher, a new PC member, what you think is a good review?
Yeah, so when I make my comparison, when I even talk about software engineering reviews, I have to compare it to the ones that I've served on for the HCI community as well. So there's a stark difference between who joins the PC and in what stage from the HCI community, like for Kai and CSCW, versus the software engineering for ICSE and FSC for the main technical track. So that's also an interesting angle. We can talk about that as well. As when Nino mentioned, like, how do we get new reviewers? And when we reach out to students, the HCI and CSCW community reaches out to students a little earlier, quite a bit earlier. And we could talk about that as well. And I would echo what Matt Dwyer said of the quality of reviews. It depends on the context. I think it's supportive to have, give best outlines of what can be improved and how, especially if you consider yourself to be a knowledgeable person in that space. It doesn't do the authors quite justice if you don't do that. So I would really echo everything Matt Dwyer said. Nothing really new to add there.
Thank you, Danae. And the next I have is Peggy. And Peggy, can you also add a little bit more on a particular type of paper, or what you look for in a particular type of paper that you think might be required in a review?
Yeah, so that's a very broad question, of course, right? Because every paper is different. And I wasn't sure what you were looking for in this, so I threw together a couple of slides, and I don't know if I should show them or just try to talk to them, but
Sure, you can share them, Peggy.
I'll show them. So let me see if I can do this.
See if I can. Yeah.
So this isn't going to be overwhelming. It's just a couple of slides, but the first thing that we do when we're looking at reviews is trying to, I guess that what I'm trying to do is trying to really understand what are the authors getting at, and then try to summarize what I see in the paper back to the authors. And to do that, we've been using a framework that I developed together with Neil, he's on the call as well, that we call the Who, What, How framework. And this basically, first of all, we try to answer who's going to benefit from this research. And you think that this would be pretty easy, but a lot of the papers that we review, it's hard to explain that. So trying to pull that out of the paper and trying to share that back with the authors is often very important. So are they trying to support practitioners? Are they trying to improve a tool? Or are they trying to maybe help researchers? So maybe they're giving some kind of research on static analysis tools that maybe practitioners aren't going to use today, but perhaps other researchers are going to build on that. And then the next thing is, what is the type of research contribution, or what kind of question is being asked, whether it's descriptive, is it exploratory, or is it a solution? So is it a tool that they're trying to build? And digging into that, we turn here to the design science idea, which is really trying to identify, is the research aimed at understanding a problem or addressing a particular problem, or is it in building a tool or maybe even evaluating a tool that's already been done? And so often the empirical work that we're trying to review, it's hard to even tease out where exactly along this sort of timeline, if you like, of the research where the evaluation is being done. So if it's a survey with developers trying to understand how they do, say, continuous deployment, then maybe that's more understanding the problem, which is over on the left. And if it's just basically trying to understand some technical part of the solution, maybe you're looking at improving precision and recall or performance, then the evaluation would be over here on the right. And if it's applying the solution to the problem, to some problem instance, then you would be basically taking the solution and applying it to an instance and seeing if it's okay. Sorry, a helicopter just flew overhead. Probably came through. And then the last part is just trying to understand which methods are used and how those methods basically match to the particular kind of questions that have been asked. And so when I'm doing a review, I try to think about it in terms of this who, what, how, and then share that back with the authors, because that helps them also understand if they did a good job of doing it. And one of the things that I've noticed a lot, I use a lot of methods, or at least I try to use a lot of methods from the social sciences, look a lot at humans, that there's often a disconnect between people who use sort of what are often called qualitative methods or quantitative methods. And so it's important to recognize that for some papers, I may not have the appropriate worldview for reviewing that paper. And likewise, somebody who has more, say, of a post-positive perspective, maybe they shouldn't be reviewing something where somebody did an ethnography in a company, because they don't fully, get maybe the methods that are being used or have experience in reviewing that kind of paper. And I want to pull up actually something that Bashar shared with us in another one of these sessions this week. And he was sharing it in terms of useful advice on which research skills are important. So he was saying, when asked a question, it's okay to be able to say you don't know. And I think, when we're reviewing papers, we should also say, this is just not in my camp. It's lovely, I'm interested in it, but I don't have the background. And likewise, he also said, when you get an answer, so if we get a finding in a paper, being able to ask, could the opposite also be true? So sometimes that is also something that's good to ask in a review as well. And I'll post a link to these. This is one paper that actually shows the differences between understanding validity between qualitative and quantitative papers. And I'll post a link to just some of the references that I referred to here. So sorry, I probably went beyond a little bit of the question that you were asking, but it's not easy to just to answer that. Because it depends, right, on the kind of paper, and it depends what you're looking for, and it depends, on the kind of findings and the questions that are being asked. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you so much. And the next person that I have on the list is Prem, who I think is going to comment a little bit about particularly empirical MSR kind of studies, I think.
So can I, thanks. Is it okay if I use some slides, May?
Sure, yeah, so do.
Okay. Just give me a second and just get the screen up. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, can you see my slides or? Yep. Okay, great. So I want to comment on a particular problem that I'm seeing more and more of that is really bothersome, which I think relates to the point that Nina was making about reviewers being overburdened and not having enough time. So I want to call this out and, hopefully have a discussion about whether other people perceive this also to be an issue and what we could do about it. So the particular problem I want to talk about is something called a drive-by review. So the drive-by review, in my definition, is the reflexive deployment of a very generic critique to a paper in a manner that is not well matched to the specific context, right? So it's kind of like a general idea. I'm going to give some examples of a negative review that you slap onto a paper, perhaps because you're pressed for time. So here's some examples of what I would call a bestiary of cheap shots, right? That are sort of like these drive-by reviews that they're just shooting from the reviewer's driver's seat, as it were, at the paper. So some examples of the things that I've seen in reviews, over the past many years. So one common complaint is effect size is too small. And this relates to the point that Peggy was making, right? So, these are all things that may be relevant in some cases, but not always, right? Another example, not enough samples, right? Another example, doesn't do or only does case studies, right? And think about all this in the context of the points that Peggy was making, which is that, like, is the particular criticism applicable to the paper that you're actually reviewing? Another example, doesn't do user studies. Are user studies really necessary in this setting? Doesn't do case studies, for example, is another example, right? Doesn't have a threats to validity section, right? Is this really necessary in every paper? And if it's missing, exactly what threats to validity are casting doubt on the conclusions of the paper that should have been discussed? Only uses open source, right? Or only uses industrial data, right? Doesn't cite X, okay? Doesn't compare with X, doesn't use methodology X, right? So in every one of these cases, again, going on what Peggy said earlier, the reviewer that is sort of throwing the shot, sniping at the paper, should be called upon to actually justify why they think this comment is pertinent to the paper, right? So the problem with using cheap shots, this kind of cheap shots at papers, is you kill the paper, but you also have like a sort of larger and more negative effect on the community, right? Often a small effect, right? If you improve defect prediction by 2%, it can help catch a lot of defects, right? If you improve the accuracy of something even by a small effect, it can be genuinely useful. So for example, in the natural language processing world, the quality of the current day today translation was hard won step by step over decades, right? So just because an effect size is small doesn't mean you should block it, right? The question is, how was that effect size achieved? Was it achieved by just throwing together some very well-known cheap things and tuning hyperparameters, or was it actually some actual genuine idea but nevertheless achieved only a small effect? So that's an important question to ask of the paper. This kind of reviewing, where reviewers are afraid that somebody's going to cast these cheap shots, leads to very formulaic, syntactically correct, syntactically correct, well-structured papers that have these particular sections. Begin with an intro, put your research questions there. Just before the conclusion, have a related work section. Before that, have a threats to validity section. It leads to these sort of formulaic papers, and perhaps they're easier to review because they're formulaic. But the problem is, this kind of behavior is self-reinforcing. People write negative reviews in ways correspond to negative reviews they have received, right? So what was good enough for me is going to be good enough for you. So since you kind of made these cheap shots at my paper, I'm going to make cheap shots on the papers you wrote, right? And it often can stifle genuinely creative work and be a roadblock to the community, right? So, May asked me to also end on a positive note, I guess. It's like, what should a good negative review do, right? So a good negative review is, to me, most of all, should really summarize the goals, the methods, and the contributions. So I feel like the reviewer understood what my paper is about, that they read it carefully, right? So if they give me a good summary of that, then I feel more confident in what they said. Now, you can also critique the goals and the contributions of the paper or the methods if you desire to do that, if you think that's appropriate. So, Absolutely, you should do that, critique them directly. And I would say, because these sorts of, kind of rote negative reviews are getting so, to my mind, they're getting very common with all these reviewers just sort of trotting out one of these cheap shots. If you use them as a PC chair and as a code reviewer, I think we should beg for a clear argument, as Peggy said, that how these cheap shots are relevant to this paper, right? Why do we need a bigger effect size for this paper, right? If a threats to validity section is missing, why is that relevant, and what did you want to see, right? If your favorite methodological take, either case studies or large sample studies, is missing from the paper, why does that matter to the conclusion of the paper? Why does that matter to the questions being asked? So I hope that we'll ask ourselves and our code reviewers, especially me, if you're code reviewing one of my papers in ASE and you think I've done one of these, hold me to it. Ask me why I'm doing that. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Prem. And one thing that I kind of want to add to what Prem said in terms of like impact is we often forget that the person receiving these reviews are humans too. And oftentimes the human is a student who this might be the first paper. Like I have now grown a very thick skin to negative reviews, the drive-by reviews. But I've had students in their undergrad or their first paper that they submit and they get a review like this and they're completely demoralized. And I think we are doing a great disservice to them, to the future of software engineering if we keep doing this, right? We need to be better than that. And with that, Prem, are you still sharing?
Oh, okay. Should I do something?
Yeah, just stop sharing. If you stop sharing, I think
I did stop sharing. I don't know if it's pause.
May, can I build on what you just said for a second?
Yeah.
So at a couple of ICSEs in the past, I've given a talk to the doctoral symposium. And I think the way I would summarize that talk nowadays is that reviewing in our community and in every scientific community, it's really a social process. And there's a social contract that's implied by it. And there's at least a couple elements to that social contract. One is that you should try to write reviews like the ones that you hope to get from other people. So there's a quality contract that should be in place. And the other, and maybe this gets at an issue that Nino brought up, there's also a quantity contract. So if I receive reviews from you, my community, then I'm obliged to agree to write reviews. And I know that's a very generic statement and it's not contextualized in the way that Peggy and Prem put it, but I think that within these, nobody wants to receive a review like Prem just described, and nobody should be writing them either for exactly that reason.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That exactly right. And this is like, I forget what it is, but expect what what you want to receive is what you should be doing to others as well. And we are basically training students to write such reviews when they become reviewers later. They're like, this is the review that I received, so this is how I'm going to evaluate. And that's not a good thing. And before I kind of ask the next person in my panel to answer, at MSR next year, we are looking to see if we can have a shadow PC where we can ask junior reviewers, PhD students who have submitted papers, to review a paper along and try to, the more senior MSR members can give kind of feedback to them about what a good review is and how they should do that. And hopefully this will be something that will help build a better reviewing community. And so the next person on that note I have in my panel is Lionel, who submits a lot of papers with companies and company data and has a particular type of problem in his papers where they say that data is not available or something. But Lionel, do you want to share some of your thoughts on what a good review should be?
Well, I pretty much agree with what everybody is saying. My only problem is that we have been discussing this for as long as I've been a PhD student, and I'm sure people before me have discussed exactly the same issues, and nothing changes. So the question is, what is the root cause of those problems? That's really, because, you know, when you talk to people, when you talk to your colleagues, everybody agrees. So if everybody agrees, why is that happening? So, you know, I'm not too sure about what the solution is, but regarding students, because those problems are not going to vanish anytime soon. Regarding students, what I tell my students is that they have to develop a thick skin. The academic world is not all rosy and friendly, and if they want to evolve into successfully and happily into a research environment, they have to be able to take criticism, however unfair. They have to accept the fact that they are going to disagree with other people about what they say, what they write, and they will have to, take that in and deal with it, because it's not going to change anytime soon. Sorry, maybe I sound a little bit pessimistic, but as I said, we have discussed that for many, many years, and it hasn't really improved. All right. With respect to industrial research, yes, we have a problem, I think. First, I don't understand why we have 2 tracks in conferences like ICSI. I don't understand why we don't have a common track. Whether it's industrial research or more academic research, it's research. Okay, it has to be assessed according to different criteria and different weights for those criteria, but nevertheless. I think in general, impact is very difficult to evaluate for many academic researchers, and therefore it tends to be undervalued. So there is more emphasis on methodology, whether, to take the example of Prem's example, whether the threat to validity section was properly written, that type of stuff. But impact and yes, is not valued as it should be very often, or the opposite, the lack of impact. Last point, because I don't want to take too much time. The last point is, this has been said, that software engineering is a very diverse field. We get many, many different kinds of papers, ranging from, qualitative studies to, operating system stuff to, whatever. And I think that diversity makes it difficult to bring together in a program committee enough experts to properly cover all papers. And very often in top conferences, the fact of the matter is that reviewers, and I include myself, that's why I'm doing less of that now, and I tend to decline those general conference program committee invitations, is that very often reviewers just are not sufficiently informed. I mean, they are not sufficiently knowledgeable about the paper they review. I would say that on average, probably 1 reviewer out of 3 is truly an expert. And that's due to the very wide diversity of our field. It's not easy to handle. We use many different methodologies. People have many different worldviews, as Peggy said, and I don't know how to reconcile all those things. It's not easy. That's why, but everybody knows that. I think I am more in favor of a journal type review process, where we have more time to find the right people. But then we get back to the problem of finding reviewers for journals, which is in part due to our conferences. Our conferences are draining our reviewing resources. So again, it's all those problems are interrelated. Anyway, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. And before I call on the next person, which is the last person in my list, I just want to say one of the things that maybe can answer this, can possibly solve this problem of not submitting bad reviews or anything, which I think Sarah and Georgios tried to implement at MSR this year, but could not because of a lot of reasons. But something for the group to think about is, should we go open reviews, like where everything is out in the open and there is more shame if you submit something that is not a good review? And instead of double blind, it's double open. If you can't sign your name on it, then don't put it. I mean, these are all just questions, right? And so something to think about, and maybe I'll do a survey at the end to see if an open review is something that we should try as well. But before we jump to that, the last person on the panel is Paul Ralph. Paul, do you want to chime in?
Sure. So the question, what makes a good review, is very difficult to answer because our field doesn't have strong consensus around what makes reviews good. So just as some examples, some people think that reviews should be long and detailed and like really dig into every sentence. And some people think that reviews should be short and concise and get to the main point of the matter. Some people think that the reviewer should give an accept or reject, like a clear accept or reject decision. And some people think that deciding whether a paper should be accepted shouldn't even be the job of the reviewer, that the reviewer job should be to just note the problems with the methodology, if any. Some people think that reviews should engage deeply in the research method. Some people think that they shouldn't. Some people think they should focus on the big picture of whether it's a good problem or whether it's clearly written. Some people think that reviews should dig into a lot of presentation issues, whether something's well written. And some people think that that's all a distraction, and that what we should really be focused on is whether the research is done right. Some people think the main criteria is that things are true. And some people think that, well, that's only one of many things. Some people think that reviewers, just are going to be jerks no matter what, and you got to grow a thick skin. And some people think that human beings are emotional human beings, and that reviewers have to learn to be nice because otherwise we're just damaging our own psychosocial selves. So if we're going to get anywhere, we have to build consensus with everybody in the community around what makes good reviews and how reviews should be and how different papers should be reviewed. It's not enough to just ask, the former chairs of the major conferences and people who've already kind of made it in the current system, what should reviews be like? Because then you get this false consensus that it seems like, oh yeah, everybody thinks that the review should be this way. No, there's no consensus about how reviews should be done. So I'm part of this ACM SIGSOFT initiative to improve peer review, and our focus is on kind of creating this consensus. So to create this consensus, we made these documents, these empirical standard documents that go through all different kinds of studies and try to nail down what should a reviewer be looking for in this kind of study. Here's an example. Now, these are not complete, but they're getting there, for systematic reviews. And you can see that instead of just expecting the reviewer to just know all of this stuff a systematic review should do, we give them a list. A systematic review should describe its search process, describe its inclusion and exclusion criteria, and so on. And we divide that list up into categories of things that you absolutely have to do, and then stuff that seems like a good idea but might not always apply. So we've done this now for 9 different kinds of research methods. And soon we'll be kind of releasing this as a kind of reviewer field manual to help people make better, deeper reviews that more directly engage with a paper's methodology instead of a kind of hand-wavy, well, is the paper sound? Well, what makes something sound means something different to all different people. So we need to create a community consensus about what it means for research to be, for different kinds of research to be sound. So that's kind of where we're going with it right now.
Thank you,
I have a
Paul.
question.
Yeah.
For Paul, this document, for Paul, this document, so you were talking a lot about norms. I'm just curious, I could have asked this in the chat, but it's easier to say it out loud. What you're describing is like norms that should be set, which are great. But for norms to be adopted, if you're familiar with procedural justice, it's valuable for people to vote and be able to contribute collectively to these documents. Can you talk a little bit about how people have collectively in the community contributed to this document?
Yeah, absolutely. So 40 different people wrote these standards. Like I didn't write them myself, right? And what we're going to do is once they're like cleaned up and ready for public consumption, we will load them up into a version control system like GitHub and invite everybody in the community to come and read them and to give feedback on them. And I just encourage everybody when that will be widely published, you won't miss it. And when you get a chance to read through the standards, and please give feedback, because it's crucial that no one feels like the standards discriminate against their kind of research or the kind of stuff that they do. Everybody's got to feel like this works for them, or else they don't, or else it doesn't work. The idea is that the documents capture and simultaneously build consensus, not force consensus on people. You can't force consensus. You have to build consensus. So it will take months to collect all of that feedback and iteratively revise the empirical standards so that they really reflect what the community feels are the important practices that different kinds of research should put in place.
So I think there's a couple of nice questions that popped up on the chat. So I'm going to just bring it up so that I think we can talk about that. Sarah kind of brings it up that what if these lists become force people to do cookie cutter papers? And Lionel had an answer that it should not be a shopping list. And true, it should not be a shopping list. But how do we make sure that this doesn't make things more formulaic? Or is formulaic the goal?
So if I can come at that directly, to some extent, a similar structure in papers may be desirable, but that's part of the consensus we're coming to. And if it turns out that people don't believe that it's desirable, then okay. But more directly with the sort of research methods side, one of the key ideas with these empirical standards is that they are not meant to be applied in a box ticking gotcha-like manner. That's like rule number one, right? That it's not something where you just go down the list and check off everything and you're done. And so to drive that home so people would remember, every standard includes a list of example deviations. So vivid examples of times when you would do something different from what the standard says for a good reason. And the standards are full of things like either you do this or you've explained why you didn't. And that's it, right? That many times, if you're going to do something different from what the sort of archetypal case is, you just have to explain why. And that should be good enough.
And I just want to chime in a little bit on this as well, is that whether we like it or not, we might have internalized one of these lists within ourselves on what we look for in a paper. So we already have lists, right? We already have some lists. Like I always look for whether the abstract and the results match. Like that is one of my list things. Is the result answering the abstract thing is my list, right? And even if I don't want to, I am somehow that's my go-to, right? Like one of the things that I always think about. And so I think we already have these lists. Maybe having a common list that is built based on consensus might be useful. And hopefully, and we should keep trying. I understand Lionel's cynicism that we've been trying to do this for a long time and it hasn't worked. And maybe it won't work next year too. But, I think maybe we should give it a shot.
So May is exactly right here, that everybody's coming in with their own implicit list of stuff they're looking for. And a lot of the rage that we feel when we read a review comes from our author list is different from the reviewer's reviewer list. And so if we can nail down consensus, even if it's imperfect consensus on what the list of things people should be looking for is, we're going to get a lot less frustration coming out of that mismatch between the author's expectations and the reviewer's expectations.
Thank you.
So,
yeah.
okay. So the one thing I wanted to add is, I've sort of like, I've from time to time submitted papers outside of software engineering. So, to security conferences, CHI, and recently to the Cognitive Science Society conference. And so one thing I will say is that, different communities vary. But I think one thing important in reviews is that the author feels seen, and this is really critical. I mean, so I remember starting in this business about 40 years ago, and often walking out of meetings feeling like I was talking a lot, but did nobody hear me? So I think that, if a review can really kind of make it clear to the author that the reviewer has read the paper, I think that's really an important thing. People want to feel seen. And if especially with students and junior people, if the review comes back and the author reads the review and feels that, did they even read what I wrote? That's really discouraging. So I think that's something that, I hope will have a good place in the community consensus on how reviews should be written. And I felt that especially CHI and CSCW and CogSci, Cognitive Science Society, they're really good at this. Perhaps because they have a strong sense of, user experience and,
Yes.
human psychology.
I'd like to maybe add something based on my experience as an editor-in-chief for 13 years of the Empirical Software Engineering Journal. I don't think bad reviews are avoidable. Maybe they can be reduced in number, but I don't think they're avoidable. And that's where associate editors for journals play a key role. Their job is to filter whatever is conveyed in the reviews and basically report to the authors, what they think is good about the paper and what are the problems based on their reading of the reviews and possibly of the paper. And for conferences, well, of course, the equivalent of the associate editor is a program chair, but the program chair usually doesn't have the time to do that. There are just too many submissions. Originally, for XC 2014, when we introduced the idea of the program board, well, there were many motivations for that, but one of the motivations is that we wanted program board members to play the role of associate editors or to help the program chairs doing that. So I don't know if the problem can be fully contained at the level of reviews. I don't think so. But we have a two-layer mechanism, in reviews and conferences. And that second layer is a very important, that is the associate editor or the program board members have a very important role to play in order to address some of the problems that you have mentioned with reviews. That should be their job. It's not always the case, unfortunately. And I remember when I was also the editor-in-chief of MC, one thing I did is that whenever there was a major revision, for example, I always made sure that that major revision was written as a contract with the authors. That is, if you achieve this, I'll accept the paper. And this came from the associate editor. It wasn't just a summary of the reviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. That is true, right? And that helps. And I think Sarah raised her hand to comment on something. I don't know if it is related to this, but
I think it can build upon this. I'm going to bring some cynicism into the conversation. Is that we're all assuming that reviewers want to do a great job, have the time to do a great job, but just they don't know how. And so we're going to give them all these guidelines to tell them how to write a good review. But we're not discussing the fact that there's zero motivation for reviewers, and a lot of them don't put in the effort because of this motivation. Yes, you're supposed to pay back your dues and all that, but if they're already struggling to review all these papers and now you're giving them extra guidelines that they have to go through and put this extra effort, are they really going to do it? So I think we have two problems: is lack of knowledge and what is really showstopper points from not showstopper points and how to put guidelines, but also how to put some proper motivation or reasonable expectations from reviewers so that they actually put in this effort.
Sarah, if I could address that directly. So I'm a little bit radical here, and I don't know if it's going to go this way, but my idea is not to inform the reviewer's essay-like review with the guidelines, but to replace the reviewer's essay-like review with the guidelines. So I envision a more structured review process in which there is a list of things that the reviewer has to check, and the reviewer's job is to check those things. And to think, you know, checking them isn't trivial. You still have to think about whether they make sense, but that would replace the writing 2 pages of commentary on a person's paper. And so if used correctly, the empirical standards should make reviewing easier and faster, not slower and more burdensome.
So I mean, those are great points. I wasn't picking specifically on those guidelines. I was just saying in general, we are ignoring the fact that you really have, like, nobody's giving you a pat on the back for doing all this extra service and doing all these extra reviews and reviewing 100 papers a year kind of thing. So I think we need to talk about that as well as how to improve the actual quality of the review, because maybe already just having more reasonable expectations, having a better motivation system somehow in place can allow people to put the time in.
And I think that's what the survey from what Nino was talking about at the top of the hour might help with, is what are the carrots, and maybe not what are the sticks, but what are the carrots that we can give to motivate people to do reviews, good reviews.
No, there are no.
Sorry, Nino.
Sorry, was that directed at me? Sorry.
No, at Nino, but Nino kind of froze.
Yeah.
But I also want, there's a lot of students on this call, and let me know if, please do try to chime in if this is not about like the previous PCs and editors chiming in alone, but it should be about the students who are now doing the research and getting the reviews to also like chime in on this, right? But Nino, yeah, Nino's unstuck. So Nino, can you, sorry, you were for a second.
Yeah, I'm unstuck. Well, let me just kind of make a comment that I thought, something that popped into my mind after when Sarah started speaking. She said Sarah, you said you wanted to bring some cynicism into the conversation. Going after Lionel and saying you want to bring some cynicism is probably the nicest thing anybody has said to Lionel. So there are lots of potential carrots. There are very few sticks we have at our disposal. We've tried things, right? And those things just don't work very well. I think that the tendency to try with putting people on these special lists and threats and pleading and so on, this has been tried a billion times before. This has not improved the problem. So we can't do what we have done in the past and expect that the results are going to be different. We have to think outside the box with regards to that. I also saw a question from Peggy about whether some of these things that have been discussed would improve things for TSC. My personal opinion is that they would not. I have tried to submit to journals where even abstracts themselves were incredibly regimented. I found it a nuisance personally. So we've also dealt with a couple of ICSIs where PC chairs have tried to divide the reviews into specific categories. So we'd have multiple scores for each paper, and those scores would flash during the physical PC meeting. And eventually you realize, I don't even know what those scores mean. Tell me what you think about the paper. You get a paper with like 7 different scores for various aspects of it: novelty, quality of writing, quality of evaluation, etc. Eventually, you can't really boil down, 2 years of somebody's work into a set of numbers. So I don't have the answers. I just think that we just need to be careful about trying to quantify some things that perhaps are inherently not quantifiable. And I'll just leave you with regard to some of the legitimate issues that Lionel in particular brought up initially about his unhappiness with how papers get reviewed. And it kind of touches upon some of the stuff that Prem mentioned in his drive-by reviews comment, and all the way back to what Peggy said. The quote from Winston Churchill, about democracy, right? It's the worst form of government except for all the others. And that's kind of how we should look at the peer review process.
We are at our time actually right now. So one thing that I would want to finish with this is I am hopeful that something we'll move the needle, as Prem said, 2% at a time or 0.2% at a time, and probably make progress. But anyone who has slides, links to surveys, material, I'm going to reach out to you. Please share them with me. I'll put them on a GitHub repository and share it put it probably on the website along with, ask the organizers to put it along the website so that the material is available as well besides just the video. And I want to thank everyone who contributed. I want to thank everyone for attending this session. Maybe the GitHub repository can also be a place where other people can add comments on what they think should be a good review, and that can start off. That can be a starting point for this. So thank you, everyone, and have a great Friday afternoon. And if at ICSI, this would be the time I'd be saying goodbye to people because it's almost the end of ICSI. But hopefully we'll see all of you at Madrid.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.